Hi everyone, and welcome to my kitchen. We're taping this still during the times of the pandemic, and I've been spending a lot of time in my kitchen and getting deep into my pantry, and I came up with a fun recipe to share with you that uses a lot of different ingredients, and it's based on a classic Boston brown bread, the kind that's baked in a can. But I've got all sorts of riffs for us that make it very, very simple. And if you don't have cans, we can use jelly jars. And if you don't like molasses or cloves, which go in the original recipe, we can use any number of spices in your spice cabinet and flours. The Boston brown bread recipe itself is very flexible. It makes a fantastic canapé. We can toast it and smother it with butter and cream cheese, or we can put ripe fruit with it or sliced ham and make it kind of fancy. All of these things we can do with this very versatile recipe. Okay, so what's in the recipe? Well, at its foundation are a cornmeal and a 100% rye flour. I got these from Meadowlark Organics, which is our neighbor actually right up the road in Ridgeway, Wisconsin, and they're also available for sale at the general store in Spring Green. I love these flours because they're stone ground, which means that all the nutrition and oil of the whole corn kernel and the whole rye kernel do get cracked and crushed in to make the meal in the flour, and that translates through with incredible flavor and nutrition. Because of the oils and the high nutrients that are retained in these flours, it's very important to keep them refrigerated. So the whole idea of this recipe is to have something that's really adaptable with what we're finding in our pantry. And it calls for 3 parts of flour. Our recipe is going to use 1 part of the rye flour, 1 part of the cornmeal, and then whatever you have in your pantry for the 3rd part. So I happen to have wheat bran, I've got some nut meal, I've got some wheat germ. You could also even use crushed cereal for the 3rd part. Okay, so the next major component of the recipe is the liquid. And the original recipe calls for milk, but honestly, you could use water, maybe with a little bit of yogurt diluted in it to activate the soda, baking soda. You could also use fruit juice. So the next major component is our sweetener for the recipe, and the original recipe calls for blackstrap molasses, which I find a little bitter. So I wanted to show you what I found in my pantry, and you might have some similar things. I have some sorghum. This is a fantastic recipe to use sorghum in if you happen to have it. Equally fantastic would be maple syrup for the sweetener. You can use honey. Also, if for some reason all you have is Karo corn syrup, you can certainly use that. And I even found in the back of my pantry some Lyle's Golden Syrup from Britain, which is a brown sugar syrup. So I mentioned activating the baking soda earlier with acidity, and we can get that acidity from the fruit juice if you choose to use that in the recipe, or yogurt if you choose to have water and yogurt combined, or even a mild fruit vinegar. All of those sources will provide enough acidity in combination with the baking soda to leaven our brown bread. I offer this as an alternative to baking powder, which can taste very bitter to some people. So this way we have a different way of leavening our quick bread. Then the next major component for our brown bread is the spicing. Very, very important. Traditionally the recipe calls for cloves or cinnamon, but I don't care for the flavor of cloves, and cinnamon gets way too much attention. So I thought it'd be fun to go deep into the pantry and find some other spices that might be lurking there. I found some ground ginger, which I think will be great, and I also found some whole spices. This is star anise, this is allspice, whole cardamom, and whole nutmeg. Whole spices can be ground down if you have a coffee grinder or in a mortar pestle, which I happen to own. I love this tool. And of course, we won't forget the salt. So I've chosen nutmeg for our recipe that I'm going to assemble today, and to handle the whole nutmeg I'm simply going to use a rasp. You can use any kind of grater, and it grates up very easily, and I'm going to make enough to have a teaspoon. I'm also going to use, and this is optional, but I found in the back of my pantry, I found some old dried fruit. These were some very delicious figs, and they're really hard, and I can't use them for pretty much anything other than to cut them up into small pieces, and the long, slow water bath baking of our brown bread will soften them. So I also found a couple old apricots, same thing, way too tough to use for any other purpose. So they're going to go into the brown bread. So now we're ready to assemble, and we're going to use the classic arrangement of putting all of our dry ingredients together and making sure our oven is turned on and we're all set to go, and then we'll add the wet ingredients and be ready to assemble the brown bread for the oven. So I have here, for the 3 parts of flour, 1 part is the cornmeal, 1 part is the rye flour, and then I have my 3rd part, which today is going to be the hazelnut meal. So that's going to go in, and then I'm going to add the other dry ingredients. So here's my baking soda, and again, folks, remember the recipe is included with your video, so all these amounts will be there. And of course, don't forget the salt. So here, that's going in, and then I have here my spices, and I'm using ground nutmeg and I'm using the ground ginger. So now all of my dry ingredients are together. I actually have a little bit of regular flour, all-purpose flour, which is in the recipe, that helps to bind the nut meal. So now all my dry ingredients are together, and I'm going to go ahead and mix them up. So here's all my dry ingredients, and I'm just going to go ahead and combine them, get the little bits of rich, oil-rich nut meal and rye flour and corn flour. Make sure to get them all mixed up, adding my chopped dried fruit, and make sure that baking soda is nice and distributed. And now it's time to combine the wet ingredients. For today's version, I'm going to use the fruit juice that I found in my pantry, and I'm going to use maple syrup because I happen to have a lot of it. But remember that sorghum or blackstrap molasses would also be delicious. So I'm going to go ahead and combine these. And at this point in your recipe preparation, you should definitely have your jelly jars all basted and your oven preheated and your water boiled for the next step before you add the wet to the dry, because the acidity in our wet ingredient is going to activate the baking soda. So we'll want to get it panned up within about 5 minutes. So here we go, folks. I'm going to go ahead and combine and mix this up into a simple slurry. And you can already start to see the baking soda is making beautiful fine bubbles. Very, very frothy, very frothy. The batter is going to go into these little jelly jars, and a trick is to put a little knob of butter into the jelly jar and set it on top of the stove. While the stove is reheating, the butter will melt, and that's a really nice, quick way to baste your jar so that the brown bread doesn't stick. It's very important to not fill the jars much more than halfway full, because the brown bread will expand in the oven. And that came out just about even with our dried fruit. Worked out to about 5 jelly jars. Take your brush that has a little bit of butter still on it and lightly baste the tops of your canning lids and set them gently on top. And now for baking in the water bath. This is what makes our Boston brown bread indestructible. I take a pot large enough to hold my jelly jars. And again, I've filled these about halfway full, not much more. Got plenty of room here. Loosely fitting canning lid on the top. And I'm going to fill the pot with boiled water to give them a nice hot start in the oven. And I will also put a lid on this. It's okay if your lid isn't completely tightly fitting. This one happens to be. And now this is going to go in the oven for approximately 45 minutes for these small ones, but I'll give you times for larger jars should you end up using something larger like the traditional can. So our Boston brown bread makes a really wonderful party canapé because it slices so neatly and can be dressed up with crumbled blue cheese or goat cheese chèvre or spicy meats and mustard and sliced fruit, ground cherries, sharp cheeses. I like to toast it with apple butter or blueberry jam. You can also enjoy it with hard cider. And you can even use this recipe to make as a base with your rum-soaked fruits to make an excellent fruit cake because it's very long-lived and wonderful for gifts.